gotten a lot of questions about my welding table, and I thought the process of moving it down to my barn would be a good opportunity to do a quick video on it. I built the table a couple of years ago, before I had started filming my projects, which I'm kind of bummed about because it was a ton of fun to build. A ton of fun to build. Get it? Before I moved the table to the barn, I wanted to resurface the tabletop. It usually finds a nice coat of grease, paint, and builds up a splatter from welding on all the different projects we do here on the farm. I thought it should start its life off right in the barn with a clean start. After working across the table with a wire brush on the angle grinder, I went back to the spots of splatter that didn't come off. Usually these will knock off with a heavy piece of metal, but the ones that are a little more stubborn, I carefully flatten with a flat disc. I really try not to gouge the table. I use the tabletop to clamp pieces of metal to while welding, and so it's really important to keep it flat. Next, I use some brake cleaner to remove the grease and paint. I've also used acetone for this, which might work a little better actually. And lastly, I gave it a coat of WD-40, which I think keeps it looking nice and keeps the splatter from sticking in the future. So when I designed the table, I decided I wanted a simple, clean, and heavy-duty welding table. I didn't want to have a bunch of attachments or drawers or other things cluttering it up. The one thing I did want to do though was to have a mechanism that lowered the table off the casters and let it stand on two solid legs. I know there are caster locks, which would have been simple to install, but it's been my experience that even when locked, these still wobble a little, and I really wanted a table that didn't budge. Until it came time to move it to the other side of the shop, then I wanted it to be budgeable. I picked it up with our skid steer, and then I started the long journey down to my barn. The idea for the welding table project was actually conceived when I was working on another project on our farm. We had an old heavy-duty tilt bed trailer that I cut apart and rebuilt to haul our sprayer buggy around on. We didn't have a need for the tilt bed anymore, which was built from some really heavy I-beams. And instead of scrapping them, I thought I could use them for a welding table base. It took hours of torching and grinding to get them cleaned up, but I couldn't beat the price. I picked up some 1/4-inch tubing from the scrap yard for the legs and got them cleaned up with the wire brush. I wanted the legs to be bolted to the inside of the I-beam, so I had to notch out some of the bottom plating so they would slide up into place. I decided to bolt them just in case I ever needed to take them off for some reason, like to get them through a narrow door. You know, if I decided to make this my dining room table down the road. I also installed a couple plugs on the side of the I-beams and a place to coil up the extension cord on one of the legs. I was originally thinking I would have clamping slots cut across the whole table, but decided in the end to only do one side. Things are constantly dropping through the slots when I'm working on that side of the table, which is a real pain. And if I didn't have the side without the slots, the table would have been much less useful. I also had them cut a perimeter around the whole table and round the corners slightly. There's nothing worse than digging your hip into the sharp corner of a welding table. I picked up the 1-inch plate and hauled it across town to a CNC company that could cut it out for me from my SketchUp drawings. I spent a lot of time polishing the top and removing the mill scale. I loved how the metal looked by the time I was done with it. And fun fact, this is now the lock screen on my phone. I fabricated a couple articulating brackets for the casters to mount to. This is the shaft mounted on the inside of the table that the bottle jack pushes up on, and in turn pushes the casters down and raises up the table. Lastly, I broke everything down for paint. My mom suggested I leave the trailer frame like it was because it looked cool, which I thought was a great idea, and so I put a couple coats of clear enamel on it to keep it from rusting. I've had the table up in the farm shop for a couple of years now, with the intention all along of taking it down to my barn when my barn was finally in a state where I could start working on projects in it. I'd always wondered how heavy the table was, and on my drive home, there happens to be a gravel pit that my distant cousin owns with the truck scales on it, and I thought I would take a minute to pull in there and see how much this thing weighed. The table was just a little too wide to fit sideways on the scale, so I was going to have to weigh the skid steer and the table, then drop the table off and weigh just the skid steer. Okay, so the skid steer alone weighs 9,000 pounds. The skid steer and the table weighs 10,980 pounds. I think if I could just do a little math on that. Bingo. K equals 1,980 pounds. I'm going to go ahead and call that a ton. Alright, enough messing around. Better get back on the road. I was really hoping to get up I-5 before the traffic got bad. Luckily I was able to, and I got home just as the sun was setting. I was so excited to be getting the table in the barn for the first time. Up until this point, I just had a wooden table with a piece of plywood on top of it, which was good for beer pong, but not so good for welding projects. I designed this spot underneath the overhang with the welding table in mind. I plan to hang a couple lights underneath it, so what I'm working on is nice and lit up. Before I had the concrete floors poured, I set a couple electrical outlets on either side of where I thought the table would be. One side is for the table's extension cord, and the other side is my 240 outlet for the welder. I felt the table looked right at home. Can't wait to put it to use now.